The wind howled through the pine trees of northern Minnesota, carrying secrets older than memory itself. In a farmhouse that had weathered 90 winters, Margaret Thompson clutched a phone with trembling fingers as a voice on the other end offered her $50,000 for something that wasn't hers to sell. Something that had been sleeping in her basement for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal its power. She would hang up that phone and make a choice that would change not just her life, but the spiritual destiny of an entire bloodline. This is the story of how one widow's act of courage awakened forces that had been dormant for 2 centuries, and why the ancestors still watch over her family today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Thompson stood at her kitchen window, watching the October sky bruise itself purple against the tree line. At 52, she felt older than the century-old farmhouse that creaked around her like arthritic bones. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she held it anyway, finding comfort in the familiar weight of the ceramic against her palms. 3 months had passed since she'd buried her husband Robert beneath the elm tree he'd planted on their wedding day, and the silence had become her constant companion. The house bore witness to 30 years of marriage, 30 years of shared dreams that had withered like the garden she no longer tended. Robert's reading glasses still sat folded on the kitchen table beside a crossword puzzle he'd never finish. His work boots remained by the back door, caked with mud from the last day he'd walked the property line, checking the fence posts that now leaned at odd angles like broken promises. Margaret hadn't moved them. She hadn't moved much of anything. Movement required energy she no longer possessed, required a future she couldn't envision. She'd taken early retirement from the Whispering Pines Museum, unable to bear the sympathetic glances of visitors who'd known her and Robert as a pair. For 23 years, she'd been the head curator, the one who could tell you the story behind every artifact, every photograph, every donated heirloom that filled the modest building downtown. History had been her passion, the past her specialty. But now she lived suspended in a present that felt more like purgatory. The farmhouse sat on 40 acres that Robert's grandfather had purchased in 1923, land that stretched from County Road 47 to the edge of what had once been called Sacred Grove. The thick forest of pine, birch, and maple had stood untouched for generations, too dense for farming, too remote for development. Local real estate agents had been circling since the funeral, sensing opportunity in her grief. The land was worth more than the mortgage she still owed, more than the medical bills that kept arriving like unwelcome reminders of her husband's final months. Margaret turned from the window and walked through rooms that echoed with memories. The living room where they'd spent quiet evenings, him reading agricultural reports while she cataloged museum acquisitions. The dining room where they'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners for her daughter Sarah, back when Sarah still came home from college, before she'd moved to Minneapolis and started building a life that had no room for a grieving mother in a house full of ghosts. The bedroom where Robert had fought his losing battle against cancer, where she'd held his hand during those final sleepless nights when pain medication couldn't touch the deeper ache of leaving everything behind. She paused at the basement door, her hand resting on the brass knob that had turned green with age. The basement had been Robert's workshop, his refuge when the weight of farming and failing health became too much to bear. But the basement held older secrets too, mysteries that predated their ownership of the land by generations. When they'd first moved in as newlyweds, they discovered a cedar chest tucked behind the furnace, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with leather straps that had survived decades of Minnesota winters. Inside, they'd found 7 carved masks, their features smooth and weathered, their expressions both serene and otherworldly. Robert had wanted to donate them to the museum, but Margaret had hesitated. Something about the masks felt too personal, too sacred for public display. She'd researched their origins, learned they were Ojibwe ceremonial pieces, likely crafted in the late 1700s for burial rituals. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each mask carved from single pieces of cedar, stained with natural pigments that had held their color across centuries. They represented the 7 directions in Ojibwe spirituality, meant to guide souls on their journey to the spirit world. The previous owners of the farmhouse, the elderly Kowalski couple who'd sold to Robert's grandfather, had left few records. But Margaret had pieced together fragments of the story through her work at the museum and conversations with tribal elders at Leech Lake Reservation. During the 1800s, when government policies forced Native families from their ancestral lands, many sacred objects had been hidden rather than destroyed. Some had been buried. Others had been entrusted to sympathetic neighbors who promised to keep them safe until they could be returned. The Kowalski family had apparently been such guardians, protecting the masks through decades of cultural suppression and federal policies designed to erase indigenous identity. When old Henrik Kowalski died in 1922, his son had no knowledge of the sacred trust hidden in his basement. The masks had waited, patient as the ancient trees that sheltered them, for someone who would understand their significance. Margaret had kept their secret for 3 decades, visiting them occasionally, always with a sense of reverence that she couldn't quite explain. Robert had respected her decision, though he'd never shared her mystical connection to the artifacts. He'd been a practical man, more concerned with soil composition and crop yields than spiritual mysteries. But Margaret had felt something in their presence, a kind of watching awareness that made her feel less alone in the world. Now, with Robert gone and Sarah building her own life in the city, Margaret found herself drawn to the basement more frequently. She'd sit beside the cedar chest, sometimes talking to the masks as if they could hear her grief, as if their carved features held wisdom about loss and healing that no living person could offer. The conversations were one-sided, but they filled the silence in ways that television or radio couldn't manage. The real estate pressure had intensified after the funeral. Developers wanted to subdivide the property, build vacation homes for wealthy Twin Cities residents seeking weekend retreats in the North Woods. The offers were generous, enough to pay off all debts and leave her financially secure for life. She could buy a small condo in town, something manageable that wouldn't require the constant maintenance that the old farmhouse demanded. It made practical sense, the kind of decision Robert would have approached with spreadsheets and careful analysis. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to sign the papers. Something beyond sentiment kept her rooted to the land, some instinct that ran deeper than financial security or practical convenience. She felt responsible for more than just the house and gardens. She felt responsible for the masks, for the sacred trust that had been passed down through generations of guardians who'd understood the weight of their responsibility. The October nights were growing longer, and Margaret found herself sleeping poorly. Dreams came in fragments that felt more like visitations than normal nighttime wanderings. She'd see figures moving through the sacred grove, hear voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The dreams weren't frightening exactly, but they carried an urgency that lingered into her waking hours. Something was stirring in the old woods, something that had been quiet for a very long time. 3 weeks after the first dream, Margaret received a phone call that would change everything. The voice belonged to a man named Robert Hayes, who introduced himself as a private collector of Native American artifacts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd heard through certain channels that she might possess items of historical significance, pieces that would be better preserved in a private collection than gathering dust in an old farmhouse basement. His tone was polite, but persistent, the kind of confidence that came from wealth and the assumption that everything had a price. Hayes explained that he represented serious collectors, people who appreciated the cultural value of indigenous art and were willing to pay substantial sums. to ensure proper preservation. He mentioned figures that made Margaret's mortgage payments seem trivial, numbers that could solve all her financial problems and leave her free to start fresh somewhere else. All she had to do was allow him to evaluate whatever pieces she might have. No obligation, he assured her. Just a conversation between people who understood the importance of historical preservation. Margaret had hung up without giving him an answer, but the call had disturbed something in her that went beyond simple reluctance to sell family heirlooms. That night, her dreams were more vivid than ever. She saw the masks as they might have been in their original context, worn by spiritual leaders guiding departed souls through the transition between worlds. She saw the fear in indigenous families' eyes as soldiers came to enforce removal policies, the desperate decisions to hide sacred objects rather than watch them be destroyed or stolen. The next morning, Margaret walked to the sacred grove for the first time since Robert's funeral. The forest was deeper than it looked from the house, thick with undergrowth and fallen logs that created natural barriers against casual intrusion. But there were paths if you knew how to look for them, deer trails that wound between the ancient trees like threads in a vast tapestry. She followed one of these paths until she reached a clearing where the morning light filtered through the canopy in cathedral rays. In the center of the clearing stood what appeared to be a natural formation of stones, weathered granite boulders arranged in a rough circle. But Margaret's trained eye recognized the intentionality in their placement, the way they created a sacred space that felt separate from the ordinary world. This had been a ceremonial site, she realized, a place where rituals had been performed long before European settlers arrived in Minnesota. The masks in her basement weren't just random artifacts. They belonged to this place, to ceremonies that had been conducted in this very clearing. As she stood among the stones, Margaret felt a presence that was both ancient and immediate. Not threatening, but expectant, as if the land itself was waiting for her to make a choice. The phone call from Hayes suddenly seemed less like a business proposition and more like a test, a moment when she would have to decide whether to honor the trust that had been placed in her family's keeping or to treat sacred objects as mere commodities to be sold to the highest bidder. She thought about the generations of people who had protected the masks, who had understood that some things were more valuable than money, more important than personal convenience. She thought about the Kowalski family, taking on the responsibility of guardianship, even though they weren't part of the culture that had created these sacred objects. She thought about the indigenous families who had made the heartbreaking decision to hide their most precious spiritual artifacts rather than watch them be destroyed. Margaret Thompson stood in that clearing for nearly an hour, feeling the weight of history and responsibility settling around her like a mantle passed down through generations. When she finally walked back to the farmhouse, she knew what her answer would be when Hayes called again. She knew what choice she had to make, regardless of the financial consequences or the personal cost. Some trusts were too sacred to break, some guardianships too important to abandon for the promise of an easier life. The masks had waited in her basement for 3 decades, patient as the ancient stones in the sacred grove. They could wait a little longer for their story to unfold, for the moment when their guardian would be tested and their true purpose revealed. Margaret didn't know it yet, but forces older than memory were already moving, preparing to honor her choice in ways she couldn't imagine. The ancestors were watching, and they had not forgotten the power of those who protect what is sacred, even when the cost seems too high to bear. The frost had settled thick on the farmhouse windows when Margaret heard the sound of an engine struggling up her gravel driveway. She wasn't expecting anyone, hadn't ordered anything, and the mail truck had already come and gone with its usual collection of condolence cards that still arrived sporadically 3 months after the funeral. Through the kitchen window, she watched a battered pickup truck emerge from the morning mist, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, exhaust pipe coughing black smoke into the crystalline air. The truck rolled to a stop beside her mailbox, and Margaret found herself holding her breath as the driver's door opened with a metallic groan. A young man stepped out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone nursing fresh injuries. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that hung past his shoulders and a face that spoke of mixed heritage, indigenous features softened by European ancestry. His left arm was cradled against his chest in a makeshift sling fashioned from what looked like a torn flannel shirt, and a purple bruise spread across his cheekbone like spilled wine. Margaret watched as he stood beside his truck for a long moment, studying the farmhouse with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. His gaze lingered on the sacred grove visible through the clearing, and something in his expression shifted. A recognition that made her pulse quicken. This wasn't a lost traveler or a salesman who'd taken a wrong turn on County Road 47. This young man was looking for something specific, and Margaret had the unsettling suspicion that he'd found it. She moved to the front door before he could knock, opening it wide enough to speak, but keeping the screen door latched. The October air bit at her face, carrying the scent of wood smoke and approaching winter. Up close, she could see that his injuries were recent, probably inflicted within the last day or two. His knuckles were scraped raw, his lower lip split and swollen. Someone had worked him over professionally, and he'd fought back hard enough to earn every mark. The young man looked up at her with eyes the color of dark honey, and when he spoke, his voice carried the careful cadence of someone who'd learned English as a second language, but had perfected it through years of academic study. "Mrs. Thompson, my name is David Crowfeather. I'm a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, working on cultural preservation projects with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. I was wondering if I could speak with you about some historical matters related to your property." Margaret studied his face, noting the intelligence behind the bruises, the way he held himself despite obvious pain. There was something about him that reminded her of the graduate students who'd occasionally visited the museum, earnest young scholars pursuing research that mattered more to them than career advancement or financial gain. But this young man carried something else as well, a gravity that suggested his visit wasn't purely academic. "You're hurt," she said, stating the obvious because it gave her time to think. "Do you need medical attention?" David Crowfeather touched his injured arm reflexively, then seemed to catch himself in the gesture. "I'm fine, Mrs. Thompson. Some disagreements are resolved with more enthusiasm than necessary, but I've had worse. What I need is more important than a few bruises." She unlatched the screen door and stepped back. "You'd better come inside then. Coffee's fresh, and you look like you could use some warmth." The young man climbed the porch steps slowly, favoring his left side, and Margaret noticed how his eyes swept the interior of the farmhouse as he entered. He wasn't being rude or invasive, but she recognized the trained observation of someone accustomed to reading environments for clues about the people who inhabited them. His gaze paused on the framed photographs that lined the mantelpiece, decades of family history captured in fading color prints. Robert at various stages of their marriage, Sarah as a gap-toothed child and later as a college graduate, the accumulated visual record of a life built on this land. In the kitchen, Margaret poured coffee into her second-best mug, the one with the small chip on the handle that Robert had always claimed was perfect for his thumb. She set it before David at the table where she and her husband had shared 30 years of morning conversations, and watched as he wrapped his uninjured hand around the ceramic warmth. "Now," she said, settling into her own chair, "what kind of historical matters bring a graduate student to my door looking like he's been through a prize fight?" David took a careful sip of coffee, and Margaret could see him organizing his thoughts, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that first impressions carried lasting weight. "Mrs. Thompson, my grandmother Elena Crowfeather is an elder with our tribal council, and she's also one of the keepers of our oral history. 3 days ago, she asked me to come speak with you about something that's been troubling her for quite some time." He paused, studying Margaret's face for any sign of recognition or defensiveness. Finding neither, he continued, "My grandmother believes that your family may have been protecting something that belongs to our people. Something that was hidden here many generations ago, during the removal period when our ancestors were forced to make impossible choices about what they could save and what they had to leave behind." Margaret felt her heartbeat accelerate, but she kept her expression neutral. 30 years of museum work had taught her the value of listening completely before responding, of understanding the full scope of a situation before committing to any particular course of action. "What kind of something are we talking about, Mr. Crowfeather?" "Sacred burial masks," David said quietly. 7 pieces carved from cedar, created by our spiritual leaders for ceremonies that guided the deceased on their journey to the spirit world. My grandmother says they've been calling to her in dreams, that the ancestors are restless because these sacred objects have been separated from their proper place for too long. The coffee mug grew heavy in Margaret's hands. She'd suspected this conversation might come someday, had even hoped for it in her more optimistic moments. The masks belonged with the Ojibwe people, not hidden in a farmhouse basement where their spiritual significance was acknowledged but not truly understood. But hearing the words spoken aloud made the situation suddenly real in a way that decades of private guardianship hadn't prepared her for. "Dreams," she repeated, testing the word on her tongue. "Your grandmother has been dreaming about masks that may or may not exist on property she's never visited, owned by people she's never met." David leaned forward slightly, his injured arm forgotten in his intensity. "Mrs. Thompson, my grandmother was born in 1923. Her great-grandfather was one of the last traditional burial ceremony leaders before the government banned our religious practices. He told her stories that were passed down through 5 generations of oral tradition, including the story of 7 sacred masks that were hidden rather than destroyed when the Indian agents came through this area in the 1880s. He reached into his jacket pocket with his good hand and withdrew a small leather pouch, placing it carefully on the table between them. "She sent this with me. Tobacco and sage, traditional offerings. She said that if you were indeed the guardian we've been searching for, you would understand the significance of proper protocol." Margaret stared at the pouch, feeling the weight of generations settling around her kitchen table. The morning light streaming through her windows seemed different now, charged with possibility and responsibility in equal measure. This young man wasn't here by accident. He was here because forces she didn't fully understand had guided him to her door, just as they'd been guiding her dreams toward this moment of decision. "The bruises," she said finally. "They're connected to this, aren't they?" David's jaw tightened, and something dangerous flickered in his honey-colored eyes. "There are people who've heard the same stories my grandmother tells, but they're interested in profit rather than cultural preservation. They've been pressuring tribal members for information about the location of sacred objects, offering money that most of our families desperately need. When I refused to share what my grandmother had told me, they decided to try persuasion of a more physical nature." Margaret thought about the phone call from Robert Hayes, the smooth voice offering substantial sums for artifacts of historical significance. The timing seemed too coincidental to be mere chance. "These people who hurt you, are they working with a collector named Hayes?" The change in David's expression was immediate and unmistakable. His whole body tensed, and the coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. "You've spoken with Hayes? He called last week. Wanted to evaluate some pieces I might have. Offered significant money for anything of cultural value." I hung up without giving him an answer, but he knew enough about my situation to suggest that someone had done their research. David set down his mug with careful precision, as if sudden movements might shatter something fragile in the air between them. "Mrs. Thompson, Robert Hayes isn't just a collector. He's the front man for an international network that specializes in acquiring indigenous artifacts through whatever means necessary. They've been systematically targeting tribal communities across the upper Midwest, using a combination of financial pressure and physical intimidation to locate and acquire sacred objects that legally belong to the tribes under federal repatriation laws. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls had moved closer together while they'd been talking. Margaret realized that her quiet farmhouse had somehow become the center of a conflict, much larger than her personal grief or financial difficulties. The masks in her basement weren't just family heirlooms or museum pieces. They were the focal point of a struggle between those who saw indigenous culture as commodity to be exploited and those who understood it as living tradition, to be preserved and honored. "How many people know about your grandmother's dreams?" Margaret asked. "Too many," David admitted. "Tribal communities aren't good at keeping secrets, especially when elders are having visions. Word spreads quickly, and Hayes has people who monitor that kind of information. He's been working this region for months, following up on every story, every rumor, every half-remembered family legend about hidden artifacts." Margaret stood and walked to the window that overlooked the sacred grove. The ancient trees stood silent and patient, their branches bare. Now, except for the stubborn oak leaves that would cling until spring forced them to surrender. Somewhere in those woods, ceremonies had been performed that connected the living world to the realm of spirits and ancestors. The masks hidden in her basement were more than historical artifacts. They were tools for navigating the boundary between life and death, between the physical world and the eternal. "Mr. Crowfeather," she said without turning from the window, "hypothetically speaking, if someone had been protecting these masks for several decades, what would be the proper way to return them to your people?" She heard the scrape of a chair as David stood, felt his presence behind her as he joined her at the window. "Hypothetically, such a person would be considered a hero by our tribal council. There would be ceremonies to honor their guardianship, formal recognition of their family's contribution to preserving our cultural heritage. But practically speaking, the process would need to be handled very carefully." Margaret turned to face him, because of Hayes and his network. Because of Hayes, and because there are legal complexities around repatriation that can take years to resolve if not handled properly. Sacred objects like burial masks fall under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, but proving ownership and cultural affiliation requires documentation that doesn't always exist for pieces that were hidden during the removal. Period. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Margaret's shoulders like a heavy cloak. For 30 years, she'd been a passive guardian, protecting the masks simply by keeping them hidden and safe. But the world had found them anyway, and now she had to choose between continuing to hide or taking active steps to ensure they reached their proper home. Either choice carried risks she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. "David," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I need you to understand something. I'm not a young woman, and I'm not particularly brave. 3 months ago, I buried my husband, and I've been struggling just to get through each day since then. I don't know if I'm strong enough to take on Hayes and his people, especially if they're willing to hurt anyone who gets in their way." David studied her face with those perceptive honey-colored eyes, and Margaret had the sense that he was seeing past her words to something deeper, some reserve of strength that she herself wasn't sure existed. "Mrs. Thompson, my grandmother says that the ancestors don't choose guardians based on physical strength or fearlessness. They choose people who understand the difference between what's right and what's easy. People who can be trusted to do what needs to be done, even when the cost is high." He reached out and gently touched the leather pouch on the table. "She also says that no one protects sacred objects alone. The spirits of those who came before always stand with the guardians, lending their strength when human courage isn't enough." Margaret looked at this young man who'd been beaten for refusing to betray his grandmother's trust, who'd driven to her farmhouse despite his injuries because preserving his people's cultural heritage mattered more than his personal safety. She thought about Helena Crowfeather, An elder who'd been having dreams about masks hidden by her ancestors 5 generations ago. She thought about the families who'd made the heartbreaking decision to hide their most sacred possessions rather than watch them be destroyed by government policies designed to erase indigenous identity. "The masks," she said quietly, "are in my basement. 7 pieces, just as your grandmother described. They've been wrapped in cedar and sage, kept in a climate-controlled environment. I've checked on them regularly, made sure they're properly preserved." David's breath caught, and for a moment, the careful composure he'd maintained throughout their conversation cracked just enough to reveal the emotion beneath. "You've been caring for them. Someone had to. The previous owners of this property were guardians before my husband and I unknowingly inherited the responsibility. We figured out what they were, understood their significance, and decided to continue protecting them until the right time came to return them to your people." Margaret walked to the basement door and turned the brass knob, feeling the familiar creak of hinges that had been opening on this secret for 3 decades. "That time has come, hasn't it?" David nodded slowly. "I believe it has. But Mrs. Thompson, once we begin this process, there's no going back. Hayes will escalate his efforts when he realizes the masks have been found. He has resources and connections that make him very dangerous, and he's already demonstrated that he's willing to use violence to get what he wants." Margaret thought about the phone calls that would probably resume, the pressure that would increase once Hayes realized she'd made contact with the tribal community. She thought about her quiet farmhouse becoming a target, her peaceful grief being interrupted by conflicts she'd never asked to join. But she also thought about the dreams that had been coming more frequently, the sense of watching presence in the sacred grove, the feeling that forces older than her personal fears were guiding events toward this moment of choice. "David," she said, her hand still resting on the basement doorknob, "what do you know about the clearing in those woods? The place with the stone circle?" His expression sharpened with interest and something that might have been reverence. "My grandmother calls it the waiting place. It's where the burial ceremonies were performed, where the masks were used to guide spirits on their journey to the ancestor world. She says it's been empty for too long, that the spiritual balance of this entire area has been disrupted because the sacred objects have been separated from their proper location." Margaret opened the basement door and started down the wooden steps, hearing David's careful footsteps behind her. The basement smelled of sawdust and machine oil, the lingering traces of Robert's workshop, but underneath those familiar scents was something older and more mysterious. The cedar chest sat exactly where it had always been, behind the furnace, wrapped in protective coverings that Margaret had replaced several times over the years. She knelt beside the chest and began unwrapping the leather straps with ceremonial care, feeling David's presence behind her like a living prayer. When the cedar lid finally opened, releasing the accumulated incense of sage and sweetgrass that had been sealed inside for decades, both of them fell silent. The 7 masks lay nestled in soft deerskin, their carved features as serene and powerful as the day they'd been hidden by families fleeing government persecution. Each face was unique, representing different aspects of the spiritual journey, from life to death and beyond. The wood had darkened with age but remained strong, the natural pigment still vibrant despite the passage of time. They were beautiful and terrible and sacred, artifacts that carried the prayers and hopes of generations of Ojibwe people who'd believed in the continuity of life beyond the physical world. David knelt beside Margaret, his injured arm forgotten, as he gazed at the masks with an expression of wonder and deep respect. "They're exactly as my grandmother described them," he whispered. "Every detail, every carving, every marking. She's been seeing them in her dreams with perfect accuracy." Margaret felt tears she hadn't expected gathering in her eyes. For 30 years, she'd been the sole witness to their beauty, the only living person who knew of their existence. Now finally, someone else understood their significance. Someone who could appreciate not just their artistic merit, but their Spiritual power. What happens now? She asked. David reached out as if to touch one of the masks, then stopped himself, his hand hovering just above the carved cedar. Now we have to get them safely to the reservation, where the tribal council can begin the proper ceremonies for their return. But first, we need to make sure Hayes doesn't intercept them during the transfer. Margaret closed the chest carefully, rewrapping it with the same reverence she'd shown for 3 decades. But as they climbed back up the basement steps, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that forces beyond their control were already moving to test their resolve. The phone call from Hayes had been just the beginning. The real challenge was about to start, and Margaret Thompson, reluctant guardian of sacred objects, was about to discover just how far she was willing to go to honor a trust that had been placed in her family's keeping. Outside, the October wind had picked up, rattling the farmhouse windows and sending leaves spiraling across the yard like messages from the ancient trees that had witnessed so much history. In the sacred grove, something stirred among the standing stones, something that had been waiting patiently for this moment when guardian and seeker would finally find each other. The ancestors were watching, and they were ready to test the courage of those who claimed to understand the sacred responsibility of preservation. The masks had been hidden long enough. The time for secrets was ending, and the time for action was about to begin. Margaret Thompson was about to learn that some guardianships require more than passive protection, that sometimes the only way to honor a sacred trust is to risk everything in defense of what cannot be replaced or forgotten. 3 hours after David Crowfeather's arrival, Margaret's farmhouse had become the planning center for an operation that felt both ancient and urgently modern. They sat at her kitchen table with maps spread between them, the leather pouch of tobacco and sage serving as a tangible reminder of the spiritual significance underlying their practical preparations. David's laptop, battery running low but still functional, displayed satellite images of the route between Birchwood and the Leech Lake Reservation. The plan they'd developed was elegant in its simplicity, but complex in its execution. The masks couldn't simply be loaded into a vehicle and driven to the reservation. Hayes had demonstrated both the resources and willingness to monitor tribal members and their activities. David's beaten pickup truck was almost certainly being tracked, either through surveillance or through contacts among local law enforcement, who weren't particularly concerned about indigenous rights. They needed misdirection, multiple routes, and contingency plans that accounted for interference from people who viewed sacred objects as lucrative commodities. Margaret had surprised herself by suggesting the most crucial element of their strategy. We don't move the masks until we know exactly where Hayes is and what his immediate plans are, she'd said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex museum acquisitions. Information is more valuable than speed. Right now, David had nodded approvingly. My grandmother always says that warriors who rush into battle without understanding their enemies usually don't return home to tell the story. They'd spent the afternoon developing contacts and gathering intelligence. David called his cousin Marcus, who worked at the casino and had developed a network of information sources that extended throughout the region. Margaret contacted her former colleagues at the Whispering Pines Museum, people who'd been tracking the illegal artifact trade longer than Hayes had been operating in Minnesota. Slowly, a picture emerged of a well-funded operation that had been systematically targeting tribal communities across 3 states. Hayes wasn't working alone. His organization included specialists in Native American law who helped their clients navigate repatriation requirements, security personnel who ensured that negotiations proceeded smoothly, and a sophisticated network of auction houses and private collectors who provided the financial incentive for the entire enterprise. They'd successfully acquired dozens of sacred objects over the past 2 years, always operating just within the boundaries of legal technicalities while applying pressure that made resistance seem futile. But they'd also made mistakes, left trails that connected them to incidents of intimidation and theft across the upper Midwest. David's laptop contained files that his academic advisor had been compiling for a federal investigation into illegal artifact trafficking. The evidence was substantial, but not yet sufficient for prosecution, partly because victims were often reluctant to testify against people who had demonstrated their willingness to use violence. The problem, David explained as he scrolled through incident reports, is that most tribal families can't afford to fight these people in court. Hayes offers quick money for objects that have been in families for generations, and when people refuse, they escalate the pressure until selling seems like the safest option. Margaret studied the photographs on the laptop screen, images of ceremonial objects that had been auctioned to private collectors despite their obvious cultural significance. Prayer pipes, medicine bundles, burial regalia that should have been repatriated under federal law, but had instead disappeared into private collections where they'd never be seen by the tribal members who had rightful claims to them. "How much are the masks worth?" she asked, though the question felt wrong as soon as she spoke it. Value wasn't the point, but understanding Hayes's motivation was crucial to anticipating his next moves. David consulted notes he'd made during phone calls with his academic contacts. Conservatively, $250,000. Possibly twice that if they're authenticated and marketed to collectors who specialize in pre-contact spiritual artifacts. The fact that they're a complete set of 7 pieces makes them exponentially more valuable than individual masks. Margaret felt sick. She'd been protecting objects worth more than her entire farm, objects that represented generations of spiritual tradition. And Hayes saw them as inventory for an international market that treated indigenous culture as exotic decoration for wealthy homes. The phone rang while they were studying maps of back roads that might provide alternate routes to the reservation. Margaret answered on the 3rd ring, recognizing Hayes's voice immediately despite his attempt to sound casual and friendly. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you've had time to consider our previous conversation. I'm actually in the area today and was wondering if I might stop by to discuss those historical pieces we talked about." Margaret met David's eyes across the table, seeing her own recognition reflected in his expression. Hayes wasn't calling from his office. He was nearby, probably watching the farmhouse, certainly aware that something had changed in the last few hours. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline suddenly flooding her. "System, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not ready to discuss selling anything just yet. I need more time to consider my options. Of course. These decisions shouldn't be rushed. But Mrs. Thompson, I should mention that I've heard rumors about other parties who might be interested in your collection. The artifact market can be quite competitive, and sometimes opportunities have a limited window. I'd hate to see you miss out on fair compensation because of interference from people who don't understand the true value of what you possess." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Hayes knew about David's visit, knew that tribal representatives had made contact, and was warning her that continued cooperation with the Ojibwe community would result in reduced offers or increased pressure. "I understand your concern, Mr. Hayes, but I'm not making any decisions today. If you'd like to discuss this further, you can call me next week. Actually, Mrs. Thompson, I'm already in your neighborhood. Perhaps I could just stop by for a few minutes, maybe take a quick look at whatever pieces you might have. No pressure. Just a professional assessment that might help you understand your options." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. Hayes wasn't requesting permission to visit. He was informing her that he was coming, regardless of her preferences. The careful politeness was a facade covering an ultimatum that left no room for refusal. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes, but today isn't convenient. I'm not feeling well, and I don't think I'm up to entertaining visitors." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Nothing serious, I hope?" Sometimes isolation can be difficult for people who are dealing with recent losses. It's easy to make poor decisions when you're not thinking clearly. The personal reference to Robert's death was designed to remind her of her vulnerability, to emphasize how much Hayes knew about her private circumstances. But it also revealed something about his character that made Margaret's fear transform into anger. This man was using her grief as a psychological weapon, treating her mourning as a tool for manipulation. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to hang up now. If you're truly interested in discussing business, you can contact me through proper channels next week. Mrs. Thompson, I really think we should talk today. I'd hate for you to make choices you might regret later, especially choices that could affect your daughter's future financial security." The mention of Sarah was the final straw. Margaret had been willing to negotiate, to consider options that might resolve the situation peacefully. But threatening her daughter, even indirectly, crossed a line that transformed the conversation from business proposition to personal warfare. "Don't ever mention my daughter again," Margaret said, her voice carrying 30 years of accumulated strength and stubbornness. "And don't call this number again unless you want me to contact law enforcement about harassment." She hung up before Hayes could respond, her heart pounding with the aftermath of confrontation. David was already moving toward the window, scanning the driveway and surrounding trees for signs of surveillance. "He's close," David said. "Probably watching the house. Definitely planning to escalate the pressure now that he knows tribal representatives have made contact." Margaret joined him at the window, studying the familiar landscape of her property with new eyes. The sacred grove that had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed like potential cover for people who meant her harm. The gravel driveway that Robert had maintained so carefully now felt like a vulnerability, providing too easy access for vehicles she didn't want to see. "We need to move the masks tonight," she said, "before Hayes decides that polite requests aren't getting him what he wants." David nodded grimly. "My cousin Marcus can meet us at the reservation boundary with an escort. Tribal police have jurisdiction once we cross onto sovereign land, and Hayes won't risk direct confrontation with federal authorities." They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for a journey that would require more courage than either of them felt ready to provide. Margaret packed the masks with the same careful attention she'd given to museum acquisitions, wrapping each piece in acid-free tissue before placing them in a specially cushioned container. David checked and rechecked the route they'd planned, identifying alternate roads and safe houses where they could stop if their primary plan failed. As the sun set behind the sacred grove, painting the western sky in shades of copper and gold, Margaret stood in her kitchen, one last time as the sole guardian of objects that had been protected by her family for 3 decades. Tomorrow, if their plan succeeded, the masks would be home among their own people, available for the ceremonies that would restore spiritual balance to the region. If their plan failed, both she and David might pay a price that neither of them was prepared to contemplate. But as Margaret locked the farmhouse and loaded the container into David's pickup truck, she felt the presence of watchers in the sacred grove, spiritual forces that had been patient for generations, but were now ready to act on behalf of those who honored their responsibilities. The ancestors were stirring, and Margaret Thompson was about to discover just how much protection they could provide for guardians who proved worthy of their trust. The battle for the masks was about to begin, and both sides had chosen their ground. But only one side understood that some fights were about more than money or possession, that some victories required the blessing of forces older than recorded history and stronger than human greed. The ancient pickup truck rumbled through the pre-dawn darkness, its headlights cutting weak paths through the mist that rose from the wetlands bordering County Road 47. Margaret gripped the passenger door handle as David navigated the rutted back roads that would keep them away from the main highways where Hayes might have positioned lookouts. In the truck bed, secured beneath a canvas tarp and surrounded by hay bales that David had borrowed from a neighbor's farm, 7 sacred masks began their journey home after more than a century of exile. They'd left the farmhouse at 4 in the morning, moving through the darkness like conspirators in their own land. Margaret had watched her home disappear in the side mirror, wondering if she'd ever see it again, wondering if the choice she'd made would cost her everything she'd spent 30 years building. But as they drove deeper into the network of logging roads that crisscrossed the northern Minnesota wilderness, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Purpose, direction, the sense that her life was moving toward something meaningful rather than simply away from loss. David drove with the concentration of someone navigating more than just physical terrain. His injured arm had stiffened overnight, and Margaret could see the effort it cost him to work the manual transmission, but he'd refused her offer to drive. This was his responsibility, he'd insisted, his burden to carry. The masks belonged to his people, and he would be the one to deliver them safely to the reservation where proper ceremonies could restore their spiritual power. "Tell me about your grandmother," Margaret said as they turned onto a fire road that seemed to lead deeper into uninhabited forest. "Elena, how long has she been having these dreams?" David downshifted carefully as the road began to climb through stands of pine and birch. 3 months now, maybe 4. At first, the family thought it was just age, you know. She's 94. And sometimes elderly people have very vivid dreams that seem real to them. But then other elders started having similar visions. Martha Kingbird, Joe Morrison, Agnes Day Sky, all of them seeing the same 7 masks, all of them feeling the presence of ancestors who were restless, unsatisfied. Margaret studied his profile in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "You believe the dreams are real communication? Spirits reaching out across generations?" "Mrs. Thompson, in my academic work, I study folklore and oral tradition from an anthropological perspective. I can analyze belief systems, trace the evolution of cultural narratives, explain the psychological functions of spiritual practices. But when my 94-year-old grandmother describes masks she's never seen with perfect accuracy, when she draws symbols on paper that match carvings made by her great-grandfather, when she knows things about your property that no living person has told her, then I have to consider possibilities that don't fit neatly into academic frameworks." They drove in comfortable silence for several miles, the forest closing around them like a protective embrace. Margaret found herself thinking about the dreams that had been disturbing her own sleep, the sense of presence she'd felt in the sacred grove, the way certain moments seemed charged with significance that went beyond rational explanation. She'd always been a practical woman, grounded in facts and documentation, but recent weeks had taught her that some truths couldn't be measured or cataloged. "David," she said finally, "I need you to know something. I've been having dreams too. Not about the mask specifically, but about the clearing in my woods, about figures moving through the trees, voices speaking in languages I don't understand but somehow recognize. I thought it was grief, my mind processing loss in strange ways. But now I wonder if something else was happening." David glanced at her with surprise and something that might have been relief. "You felt them calling to you." "I felt something. A presence, a watchfulness. Like I was being evaluated, tested." Somehow, Margaret paused, organizing thoughts she'd never spoken aloud. "The night before you arrived, I dreamed I was standing in the stone circle, and there were people around me dressed in traditional clothing, but their faces were carved from wood, like masks. They didn't speak, but I understood they were waiting for me to make a choice." "The Guardian's test," David said quietly. "My grandmother told me about it, though I wasn't sure I believed her. She said that when sacred objects are ready to return home, the ancestors evaluate the guardians who've been protecting them. They want to know if the guardian understands the responsibility, if they're willing to sacrifice personal safety for the greater good of cultural preservation." Margaret thought about Hayes's threats, about the comfortable life she was risking by choosing to honor a trust she'd inherited rather than inherited by accident. And if the guardian fails the test, then the objects remain lost, and the spiritual Imbalance continues until another guardian emerges who's worthy of the responsibility. The fire road crested a ridge, and suddenly the forest opened into a vast panorama of lakes and wetlands stretching to the eastern horizon. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, reflecting off water that had witnessed thousands of years of human habitation. This was the heart of Ojibwe country, land that had supported Margaret's ancestors long before European settlers arrived with their maps and treaties and assumptions about ownership. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, understanding for the first time why David's people had fought so hard to remain connected to this landscape. "My grandmother says the land remembers everyone who's ever walked on it with respect. She says the spirits of place don't distinguish between indigenous and non-indigenous people when evaluating their hearts. They only care about whether someone understands that they're part of something larger than their individual lives." They descended the ridge and entered a different kind of forest, older and denser, where massive pines towered above thick understory that had never felt the bite of logging saws. This was original growth, Margaret realized, forest that looked exactly as it had when the masks were first carved centuries ago. The road here was barely more than a track, requiring David to navigate carefully around boulders and fallen logs that spoke of winter storms and the slow passage of seasons. "We're on tribal land now," David said, though Margaret couldn't see any markers or boundaries. "My cousin Marcus should be waiting at the next clearing with an escort." As if summoned by his words, they rounded a curve and emerged into a small meadow where two vehicles waited in the early morning light. A newer pickup truck sat beside what appeared to be a modified van, both displaying the distinctive license plates of the Leech Lake Reservation. 3 men stood beside the vehicles, and Margaret could see the family resemblance between David and the tall, broad-shouldered man who stepped forward as they parked. Marcus Crowfeather moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his environment. He was older than David, probably in his late 30s, with graying hair pulled back in a traditional braid, and eyes that assessed situations quickly and thoroughly. When he embraced his younger cousin, Margaret could see both relief and concern in his expression. "Grandmother's been awake all night," Marcus said without preamble. "She says the ancestors are stirring, that something important is happening today. The tribal council has cleared the ceremonial grounds, and Elder Morrison is preparing for a welcoming ceremony." He turned to Margaret with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Thompson, my family owes you a debt that can never be repaid. What you've done, protecting our sacred objects for all these years, is the kind of courage that our children will learn about in stories passed down through generations." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the formality of his gratitude. "I only did what seemed right. Anyone would have made the same choice." "No," said one of the other men, stepping forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Most people would have sold the masks long ago, or donated them to a museum where they'd be displayed as curiosities rather than honored as sacred objects. You understood that guardianship means more than possession." This was Thomas Day Sky, Margaret learned, a member of the tribal council and a veteran of decades of battles over repatriation and cultural sovereignty. His presence emphasized the significance of the moment, the fact that returning the masks was more than a simple transfer of property. It was a restoration of spiritual balance that had been disrupted for generations. "We need to move quickly," Thomas continued, glancing toward the access road they'd used to reach the clearing. "Our sources tell us that Hayes has been mobilizing resources since yesterday evening. He's brought in additional personnel, people with military backgrounds who aren't bound by the legal restrictions that normally limit his operations." David carefully lowered the tailgate of his truck, revealing the canvas-covered container that held 30 years of patient guardianship. Marcus and Thomas approached with visible reverence, understanding that they were about to witness the return of objects their ancestors had died trying to protect. When David pulled back the canvas, revealing the carefully wrapped bundles nested in protective padding, Thomas Day Sky made a sound that was part prayer and part wounded cry. Marcus reached out as if to touch one of the bundles, then stopped. Himself, recognizing the need for proper ceremony before sacred objects could be handled. "They're real," Marcus whispered. Grandmother's dreams were true visions. Margaret watched as the three Ojibwe men stood in silent communion with masks they'd known only through oral tradition and spiritual dreams. The morning light seemed different in the clearing, charged with significance that made ordinary conversation feel inadequate. She was witnessing a reunion between a people and their sacred heritage, a moment when stories passed down through 5 generations of oral tradition were confirmed as historical fact. "Mrs. Thompson," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you be willing to accompany us to the reservation? Elder Crow Feather specifically requested the opportunity to thank you personally, and the Tribal Council wants to formally recognize your family's guardianship with a ceremony of appreciation." Margaret hesitated, thinking about the farmhouse she'd left unprotected, about Hayes and his escalating threats, about the comfortable anonymity she was sacrificing by becoming publicly associated with the return of the masks. But she also thought about Elena Crow Feather, a 94-year-old woman who'd been having dreams about objects hidden in a basement she'd never seen. And she knew her answer. "I'd be honored," she said. The convoy that formed in the meadow clearing represented more than simple transportation. It was a procession, a ceremonial escort bringing sacred objects home after more than a century of exile. Marcus drove the lead vehicle, followed by David and Margaret in the battered pickup truck, with Thomas Day Sky bringing up the rear in the van that Margaret now realized contained additional tribal police officers providing security for the transfer. As they drove deeper into the reservation, Margaret saw a landscape that had been shaped by both traditional knowledge and modern necessity. Traditional buildings stood beside contemporary homes, and she glimpsed gardens where native plants grew alongside crops that represented generations of adaptation to changing circumstances. This wasn't a museum display of indigenous life frozen in historical amber. This was a living community that had maintained its cultural identity while evolving to meet the challenges of each successive generation. "The ceremonial grounds are just ahead," David said as they topped a hill that overlooked a natural amphitheater formed by ancient glacial activity. "The stone circle there is original, placed by our ancestors as a gathering place for important ceremonies. It's where the masks will be formally received and where their spiritual power will be restored through proper ritual." Margaret could see perhaps 50 people gathered in the amphitheater, men and women of all ages dressed in a mixture of contemporary clothing and traditional regalia. Elder women sat in chairs that had been arranged in a semicircle, while younger tribal members stood respectfully behind them. At the center of the gathering, a small fire burned in a metal bowl, sending smoke skyward that would carry prayers to the ancestor world. As their convoy approached, Margaret noticed a disturbance among the gathered people. Someone was pointing toward the access road, and several of the younger men were moving with purpose toward the edge of the ceremonial area. Thomas Day Sky's van accelerated past them, and Margaret could see the driver speaking urgently into a radio. "What's happening?" Margaret asked. David checked his rearview mirror and cursed softly in Ojibwe. "Company. Hayes found us." Margaret turned to look back and saw a line of black SUVs cresting the hill behind them, moving fast enough to close the distance before they could reach the safety of the ceremonial grounds. Hayes had somehow tracked their movements, anticipated their destination, and mobilized a response that suggested resources far beyond what any legitimate collector should possess. "How many vehicles?" David asked, downshifting as he pushed the old pickup truck to its maximum safe speed. "4, maybe 5. David, there are civilians here, elders and children. If Hayes starts a confrontation on sacred ground, he won't," David said with grim certainty. Not if he understands anything about federal law and tribal sovereignty. But he might try to intercept us before we reach the ceremonial circle. The race to the stone circle became a test of nerve and mechanical reliability as David coaxed every possible mile per hour from his aging truck while Hayes's professional drivers closed the gap in vehicles designed for exactly this kind of pursuit. Margaret found herself gripping the door handle again, but this time her fear was mixed with determination. They'd come too far and risked too much to let the masks be stolen within sight of their ancestral home. Marcus had reached the ceremonial grounds and was speaking rapidly with tribal police officers who'd been providing security for the event. Margaret could see people scattering, elders being helped to safer positions while younger tribal members formed a protective barrier around the stone circle. This was their land, their sacred space, and they weren't going to surrender it to outsiders who treated indigenous culture as merchandise. David's truck slid to a stop beside the stone circle, just as the first of Hayes's SUVs crested the final hill. The container holding the masks was immediately surrounded by tribal members who formed a human shield around the sacred objects, while tribal police officers took positions that would prevent Hayes's people from approaching the ceremonial area. Margaret climbed out of the truck and found herself face to face with Elena Crowfeather, a tiny woman whose age had compressed her to barely 5 feet tall, but whose presence filled the space around her like gathering weather. The elder's dark eyes, bright with intelligence despite her advanced years, studied Margaret with an intensity that felt like being examined by forces older than recorded history. "You are the guardian," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly, despite its whispered delivery. "The one who kept them safe when no one else could. The ancestors have been singing your name for 3 months." Before Margaret could respond, Elena reached out and took her hands in a grip that was surprisingly strong. "They told me you would be tested, that forces of greed would challenge your resolve. They told me you would prove worthy, that your bloodline would be blessed for generations because of the choice you made today." The black SUVs had stopped at the edge of the ceremonial grounds, their occupants apparently recognizing that federal law protected tribal sovereignty on reservation land. Margaret could see Hayes through the windshield of the lead vehicle, his face twisted with frustration as he realized that his quarry had reached sanctuary beyond his legal reach. "Mrs. Crowfeather," Margaret said, "I need you to understand something. I'm not a particularly brave person. I'm just a widow who inherited a responsibility I didn't fully understand. I don't know if I deserve the gratitude of your people or the blessing of ancestors I've never met." Elena's laugh was like water running over ancient stones, musical and eternal. "Child, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to do what's right, despite being afraid. You faced down powerful enemies to honor a trust that wasn't legally yours. That brought you no profit, that put your own safety at risk. If that isn't courage worthy of ancestral blessing, then my 94 years have taught me nothing about the nature of heroism." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced, a blending of ancient ritual and contemporary celebration that transformed the return of the masks into something approaching religious significance. Elder Morrison spoke words in Ojibwe that carried the accumulated prayers of generations, while smoke from sacred fires carried those prayers to the ancestor world where spirits of the past could witness the restoration of spiritual balance. When the masks were finally unwrapped and displayed in their full ceremonial significance, even Hayes's distant surveillance couldn't diminish the power of the moment. These weren't museum pieces or collectible artifacts. They were living connections between the world of the living and the realm of spirits, tools that would once again guide deceased tribal members on their journey to eternal rest. Elena Crowfeather stood beside Margaret throughout the ceremony, occasionally translating portions of the Ojibwe prayers, but mostly allowing the sacred words to speak for themselves. As the sun reached its zenith and the ceremony approached its conclusion, the elder took Margaret's hands once more. "The ancestors want you to know," Elena said, "that your protection of the masks has been recorded in the eternal stories of our people. Your bloodline will carry their blessing forward through time, and when your own journey to the spirit world begins, they will be waiting to guide you safely home." Margaret felt tears she hadn't expected, gratitude for recognition she'd never sought from people whose approval meant more than she'd realized. She'd begun this day as a lonely widow trying to honor an inherited responsibility. She was ending it as an honorary member of a community that understood the true meaning of guardianship, the sacred duty to protect what cannot be replaced or recovered. But as the ceremony concluded and Hayes's SUVs finally departed, Margaret also understood that her transformation was just beginning. The ancestors had blessed her bloodline, but blessings came with responsibilities. She was no longer simply the guardian of objects that belonged to others. She had become a bridge between communities, a living reminder that some trusts transcend the boundaries of blood and culture. The battle for the masks was over, but Margaret Thompson's real journey was just beginning. The ancestors were watching, and they had plans for their newly tested guardian that would require all the courage she'd discovered within herself and more wisdom than one lifetime could provide. The drive back to Birchwood felt different from every other journey Margaret had taken along these familiar roads. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windshield of David's pickup truck, and the October landscape seemed to glow with a richness she'd never noticed before. Colors appeared more saturated, sounds carried further, and the very air felt charged with possibility. Elena Crowfeather's words echoed in her mind like a blessing that had taken root in her soul. "Your bloodline will carry their blessing forward through time." Beside her, David drove with the careful attention of someone who'd just witnessed something that would reshape his understanding of the world. The ceremony at the stone circle had affected him profoundly, not just as an academic studying indigenous culture, but as a tribal member whose own spiritual connection to his ancestors had been strengthened by the return of the sacred masks. His injured arm no longer seemed to cause him pain, and there was a lightness in his bearing that hadn't been there during their desperate early morning journey. "Mrs. Thompson," David said as they turned onto County Road 47, "what you experienced today, the recognition from Elder Crowfeather and the Tribal Council, it's not something that happens often. Most non-Indigenous people who work with our community remain allies and friends, but they don't become part of our spiritual family. The ancestors chose you for reasons that go beyond your guardianship of the masks." Margaret watched the familiar landmarks of her neighborhood emerge from the forest, but everything looked subtly transformed. The abandoned barn that marked the turnoff to her property seemed to lean at a different angle. The mailboxes of distant neighbors appeared more weathered, as if she'd been gone for months rather than a single day. Even her own driveway, when it finally came into view, looked somehow foreign, like she was returning to a place she'd lived in a previous lifetime. "David," she said slowly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you think Hayes will retaliate? I understand that he couldn't legally pursue us onto tribal land, but now that the masks are safely transferred, will he try to punish me for interfering with his plans?" David's expression grew serious as he considered the question. "Robert, Hayes is a businessman who deals in stolen cultural artifacts. He's invested significant time and resources in acquiring those masks, and he's not the kind of person who accepts defeat gracefully. But he's also smart enough to know that escalating a conflict with someone who now has the protection of tribal law enforcement would bring federal attention he can't afford." They pulled into Margaret's driveway, and she was surprised to see lights burning in windows she was certain she'd left dark. A newer sedan sat parked beside the front porch, and smoke rose from the chimney in a steady ribbon that suggested someone had been tending the fire for hours. "Expecting company?" David asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the glove compartment where Margaret suspected he kept some form of protection. "No one should be here," Margaret said, then stopped as the front door opened and a familiar figure stepped onto the porch. Sarah? Margaret's daughter looked exactly as she had during their last awkward conversation 6 weeks earlier, when Sarah had driven up from Minneapolis to help sort through Robert's belongings and had left early, after they'd argued about Margaret's refusal to consider selling the farm. Sarah was 31 now, a successful marketing manager with a downtown condo and a carefully planned life that had little room for aging parents or childhood homes that required constant maintenance. But something in Sarah's posture was different as she walked toward the truck. Gone was the impatient energy that usually characterized her visits, the subtle pressure she exerted on Margaret to make practical decisions about downsizing and moving to a more manageable living situation. Instead, Sarah moved with hesitant uncertainty, like someone who'd received news that had fundamentally altered her understanding of the world. "Mom," Sarah said as Margaret climbed out of the truck, "we need to talk. Some very interesting people have been calling me." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "What kind of people?" "The kind who know things about our family that I certainly never told them. The kind who seem to think you've been involved in some sort of illegal artifact trafficking operation. The kind who suggested that I might want to intervene before you make choices that could affect both our futures." David emerged from the driver's side of the truck, and Margaret saw Sarah's eyes widen as she took in his obvious injuries and the general air of tension that surrounded him like a visible aura. This wasn't the simple visit from a concerned daughter that Margaret had initially assumed. This was another move in Hayes's campaign to pressure her into compliance, but this time he was using her family as leverage. "Sarah, this is David Crowfeather. He's a graduate student from the University of Minnesota who's been helping me with some historical research. David, this is my daughter Sarah." David nodded politely, but Margaret could see him evaluating Sarah with the same careful attention he'd shown when assessing potential threats throughout their day together. Sarah's unexpected presence at the farmhouse, especially after receiving calls from Hayes's people, represented a complication that could undermine everything they'd accomplished. "Historical research," Sarah repeated, her tone suggesting she found the explanation inadequate. "Mom, the man who called me said you were in possession of stolen Native American artifacts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He said you were planning to sell them illegally, and that family members could be held legally responsible for participating in federal crimes." Margaret felt her carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. Hayes wasn't content with losing the masks. He was escalating his campaign of intimidation to include her family, using Sarah's legitimate concern for her mother's welfare as a weapon against Margaret's newfound resolve. "Sarah, let's go inside where we can discuss this properly. David, would you mind joining us? I think it's important that you hear this conversation." The farmhouse felt smaller with 3 people occupying the kitchen that had served as Margaret's solitary refuge for months. Sarah moved through the familiar space with the confidence of someone who'd grown up here, automatically starting coffee and arranging chairs around the table where Margaret and David had planned their morning's adventure. But there was tension in her movements, worry that expressed itself through excessive attention to domestic details. "Mom," Sarah said as she served coffee in the mismatched mugs that had accumulated over 30 years of marriage, "I drove up here because I was genuinely frightened by the phone calls I received. The man who contacted me knew details about Dad's medical bills, about the mortgage payments you've been struggling with, about the property tax assessments that have been increasing every year. He knew things that suggested he'd been investigating our family finances for quite some time." Margaret exchanged glances with David, both of them recognizing the thoroughness of Hayes's preparation. This wasn't a spontaneous escalation of pressure. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to isolate Margaret from potential family support while demonstrating the extent of Hayes's resources and determination. "What exactly did he tell you?" Margaret asked. He said that you'd come into possession of valuable artifacts that legally belonged to various tribal communities, and that instead of returning them through proper channels, you were planning to sell them on the black market. He said that federal law enforcement was already investigating the situation and that family members who didn't cooperate with the investigation could be charged as accessories to federal crimes. Sarah paused, studying her mother's face for signs of guilt or confirmation. He also said that if I could convince you to work with legitimate collectors rather than criminal networks, the legal problems could be resolved quietly and profitably for everyone involved. David leaned forward, his academic training evident in the careful way he organized his response. Ms. Thompson, I need you to understand that everything this man told you was designed to manipulate your relationship with your mother. Federal artifact repatriation laws don't criminalize families who've been unknowingly protecting sacred objects. In fact, people who voluntarily return cultural items to their rightful tribal communities are specifically protected from prosecution. Sarah looked between David and Margaret with growing confusion. So there are artifacts? You have been hiding Native American cultural objects? Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hands, feeling the soft skin that she remembered from childhood, noting the expensive manicure that spoke of Sarah's successful urban life. Honey, your father and I discovered 7 ceremonial masks when we moved into this house 30 years ago. We researched their origins, learned that they were sacred Ojibwe burial masks that had been hidden during the removal period in the 1800s. We decided to protect them until the right time came to return them to the tribal community. And today was that time, David added. Your mother participated in a formal repatriation ceremony this morning. The masks are now safely home with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, where they'll be used for their intended spiritual purposes. Sarah released her mother's hands and leaned back in her chair, processing information that clearly challenged her assumptions about both the situation and her mother's capabilities. You returned artifacts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars without consulting anyone? Without considering the financial implications for your future security. Margaret felt a familiar frustration rise in her chest, the same emotion that had ended their last conversation with harsh words and hurt feelings. Sarah's immediate focus on financial value rather than cultural significance revealed the fundamental difference in their worldviews. The gap between Margaret's growing understanding of sacred responsibility and Sarah's practical approach to problem solving. Sarah, some things are more important than money. These masks weren't ours to sell. They were sacred objects that had been entrusted to our family's protection. Selling them would have been a betrayal of that trust and a desecration of their spiritual significance. But Mom, you're struggling financially. The medical bills from Dad's cancer treatment, the mortgage payments, the property taxes, the general maintenance on this old house. You could have used that money to secure your future, maybe even set aside something for grandchildren you might have someday. David cleared his throat diplomatically. Ms. Thompson, if I may offer some perspective from my academic research, families who profit from the sale of sacred objects often experience what tribal elders call spiritual consequences. Economic gain that comes from desecrating cultural heritage tends to bring this fortune that exceeds any temporary financial benefit. Sarah's expression suggested skepticism bordering on dismissal. With all due respect, Mr. Crowfeather, my mother is a practical woman who needs practical solutions to real-world problems. Spiritual consequences don't pay utility bills or cover emergency medical expenses. Margaret watched her daughter's face and saw herself as she'd been 30 years earlier, focused on material security and conventional definitions of success. But she also saw the fear beneath Sarah's practical concerns, the genuine worry about her mother's welfare that made financial considerations seem paramount. Sarah, Margaret said gently, I need to tell you about something that happened today at the repatriation ceremony. Elena Crowfeather, the tribal elder who's been having dreams about the masks, told me that the ancestors have blessed our bloodline for the guardianship our family provided. She said that blessing will protect and guide our family for generations. Sarah's skepticism was evident in her expression, but Margaret continued before her daughter could voice objections. I know that sounds like superstition to you, but I've experienced things lately that can't be explained by rational analysis. Dreams, visions, a sense of presence and guidance that's helped me navigate situations I couldn't have handled alone. David nodded in agreement. Ms. Thompson, I understand your mother's experience because I've witnessed similar phenomena in my own family and research. Indigenous spiritual traditions include concepts that don't translate easily into contemporary Western frameworks, but that doesn't make them any less real or significant for the people who experience them. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle in the driveway, engine noise that suggested something larger and more powerful than the usual rural traffic on County Road 47. Margaret moved to the window and felt her stomach tighten as she recognized one of the black SUVs that had pursued them to the reservation that morning. Hayes, she said quietly. He's here. David joined her at the window, studying the vehicle that had parked strategically to block the driveway. Just one SUV. Probably Hayes himself, maybe one security person. He's not planning physical confrontation. This is psychological pressure, designed to demonstrate that he can reach you anytime he wants. Sarah stood as well, her face pale as she absorbed the reality of a situation that had seemed abstract when described over the phone. Mom, who is Hayes? What does he want? Robert Hayes is a criminal who specializes in stealing indigenous cultural artifacts for resale to private collectors, Margaret explained. He's been pressuring me to sell him the masks, and when I refused, he escalated to threats and intimidation. The front door knocker sounded with deliberate authority, 3 measured impacts that conveyed confidence and implied inevitability. Margaret felt her newfound courage falter slightly, but she also remembered Elena Crow, Feather's words about ancestral protection and the spiritual strength that came from honoring sacred responsibilities. I'll answer it, she said, moving toward the door before David could object. Mrs. Thompson, you don't have to face him alone, David said, moving to follow her. Actually, she does, Sarah said unexpectedly. If this man is as dangerous as you suggest, then involving others might escalate the situation unnecessarily. But Mom, I'm calling the sheriff's department while you talk to him. Margaret opened the front door to find Robert Hayes standing on her porch with the casual confidence of someone making a social call. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of expensive casual clothing that suggested wealth without ostentation. His smile was warm and practiced, the expression of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm rather than force. Mrs. Thompson, thank you for agreeing to see me. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I felt we needed to have a conversation about the misunderstanding that occurred earlier today. Margaret kept the screen door latched between them, maintaining physical separation while demonstrating her willingness to listen. Mr. Hayes, there's no misunderstanding. I've returned the masks to their rightful owners through proper legal channels. Whatever business you thought we might have is concluded. Hayes's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardness that suggested the charm was carefully calculated rather than genuine. Mrs. Thompson, I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than you've been led to believe. The young man who's been advising you, Mr. Crow Feather, doesn't have the legal authority to accept cultural artifacts on behalf of the Leech Lake Band. Any transfer of property that valuable requires documentation and procedures that weren't followed during today's ceremony. Margaret felt uncertainty creeping into her resolve. Could David have misled her about the legal requirements for repatriation? Had her eagerness to honor the spiritual significance of the masks blinded her to practical legal necessities? Mr. Hayes, I'm not qualified to evaluate the legal technicalities of artifact repatriation. If there are procedural problems with today's transfer, I'll consult with attorneys who specialize in federal Indian law. Of course. But Mrs. Thompson, legal proceedings can take months or even years to resolve, and during that time, the artifacts remain in legal limbo. Meanwhile, you're still responsible for their security and preservation, and you're still potentially liable for any civil or criminal violations that might arise from improper handling of cultural property. Hayes paused, allowing the weight of potential legal consequences to settle in Margaret's mind. I'm prepared to offer you a solution that eliminates all legal risk while providing fair compensation for the years your family spent protecting these valuable pieces. My clients are legitimate collectors who work within established legal frameworks. They can provide documentation that would satisfy any federal investigation, and they're willing to pay substantially more than the masks would bring through normal auction channels. Margaret heard Sarah's voice behind her, speaking urgently to someone on the phone, presumably reporting Hayes's presence to local law enforcement. But she also heard something else, a whispered sound that might have been wind in the pine trees, or might have been voices speaking in languages older than recorded history. The sensation she'd experienced in the sacred grove returned, that sense of watching presence that offered strength beyond her own limited human resources. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret said, her voice carrying new authority, "I appreciate your concern about legal technicalities, but I'm confident that the repatriation ceremony this morning was conducted according to proper protocols. The masks are home, where they belong, and I have no intention of participating in any arrangement that would remove them from their spiritual context." Hayes's expression darkened slightly, the practiced charm slipping just enough to reveal the calculating intelligence beneath. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you understand that there are consequences for interfering with legitimate business transactions. The artifact market operates according to established relationships and professional courtesies. People who disrupt those relationships sometimes find that their own lives become more complicated." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd used intimidation successfully many times before. But Margaret found that fear no longer dominated her emotional response. Instead, she felt anger at Hayes's assumption that spiritual traditions could be reduced to market transactions, that sacred objects could be treated as merchandise for wealthy collectors. "Mr. Hayes, I think you should leave now. If you have legal concerns about today's repatriation ceremony, you can address them through proper legal channels. But I won't be intimidated into betraying a trust that my family has honored for 30 years. Hayes studied her face for a long moment, apparently recognizing that conventional pressure tactics weren't working as effectively as he'd expected. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you'll reconsider your position. Sometimes the protection that people think they have isn't as strong as they believe. Sometimes family members can become unexpectedly vulnerable when they're associated with people who make poor choices." The reference to Sarah was unmistakable, and Margaret felt her maternal instincts override any remaining uncertainty about the confrontation. "Are you threatening my daughter, Mr. Hayes?" "I'm simply observing that the decisions we make often affect the people we care about in ways we don't anticipate. I hope your family remains safe and prosperous, but that depends partly on the choices you make going forward." Hayes turned and walked back toward his SUV with the unhurried pace of someone who delivered his message and didn't need to wait for an immediate response. Margaret watched him drive away, noting that he turned toward town rather than toward the highway that would take him back to whatever urban center served as his base of operations. He wasn't leaving the area. He was repositioning for whatever pressure he planned to apply next. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah had finished her call to the sheriff's department and was standing beside David at the kitchen table, both of them studying Margaret with expressions of concern and admiration. "Mom," Sarah said, "I heard most of that conversation through the screen door. I need to apologize for doubting your judgment about this situation. That man is genuinely frightening, and I can see why you felt you needed to take action to protect the masks from him." Margaret felt relief at her daughter's support, but she also recognized that Sarah's approval was based more on fear of Hayes than on understanding of the spiritual significance that had motivated Margaret's choices. It was a beginning, but not yet the kind of comprehension that would sustain family unity through whatever challenges lay ahead. "Sarah, I need you to understand something important. Returning the masks wasn't just about preventing Hayes from stealing them. It was about honoring a sacred trust that connected our family to something larger than our individual lives. The blessing that Elena Crowfeather spoke about, the ancestral protection she promised, these aren't superstitions. They're spiritual realities that will guide and protect our family for generations." David nodded in agreement. "Ms. Thompson, what your mother accomplished today will be remembered in our tribal community for as long as our oral traditions survive. The story of the widow who protected sacred masks and returned them to their people will become part of our cultural heritage, passed down through generations of tribal members who understand the significance of what she sacrificed." Sarah looked between her mother and David, clearly struggling to reconcile her practical worldview with concepts that transcended material considerations. "I don't fully understand the spiritual aspects of what you've done, Mom, but I can see that it's given you a sense of purpose and strength that you've been missing since Dad died. And I can certainly see that Hayes represents the kind of threat that justifies taking significant risks to oppose." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hands again, feeling the connection between generations that would carry Elena Crowfeather's blessing forward through time. "Sarah, the ancestors don't require you to understand their ways completely. They only require you to respect the choices that honor sacred responsibilities and to trust that some protections operate beyond human understanding." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle in the driveway, but this time the engine noise was familiar and reassuring. Through the kitchen window, Margaret could see Sheriff Tom Bradley's patrol car, followed by what appeared to be an unmarked federal vehicle that suggested law enforcement resources beyond local jurisdiction. Sheriff Bradley was a man Margaret had known peripherally for years, someone who'd occasionally checked on her property during Robert's illness and who'd expressed condolences after the funeral with genuine sympathy. But the federal agent who accompanied him represented resources and authority that transformed the situation from local dispute to matter of national significance. "Mrs. Thompson," Sheriff Bradley said when Margaret answered the door, "this is Agent Jennifer Morrison from the FBI's art crime team. She'd like to speak with you about Robert Hayes and his artifact trafficking operation." Agent Morrison was a woman in her late 30s with the kind of professional bearing that suggested extensive experience with complex investigations. She shook Margaret's hand with firm confidence while studying the farmhouse and surrounding property with the trained observation of someone gathering evidence. "Mrs. Thompson, we've been investigating Hayes's organization for 18 months. Building a case that includes multiple federal charges related to trafficking in stolen cultural artifacts. Your cooperation with tribal authorities in repatriating the Ojibwe masks has provided us with evidence that supports several aspects of our investigation." Margaret felt simultaneous relief and apprehension. Federal law enforcement involvement would certainly discourage Hayes from escalating his intimidation campaign, but it also meant that her quiet farmhouse had become part of an investigation that might require testimony and public exposure she wasn't prepared to handle. "Agent Morrison, I'm willing to cooperate with your investigation, but I need you to understand that I'm not an expert on artifact trafficking. I simply inherited a responsibility that I tried to honor according to my best understanding of what was right. Mrs. Thompson, sometimes the most valuable witnesses in federal investigations are ordinary citizens who've been targeted by criminal organizations. Your experience with Hayes, documented through phone records and witness testimony, helps establish patterns of behavior that support broader charges against his network. Agent Morrison paused, studying Margaret's face with professional assessment. I also need to tell you that Hayes's organization has been connected to several incidents of violence against tribal members and artifact guardians who've refused to cooperate with their acquisition efforts. Your safety, and that of your family, is a legitimate concern that we're prepared to address through appropriate protective measures. Margaret thought about Sarah's presence at the farmhouse, about the daughter who'd driven from Minneapolis because of threats against their family, about the responsibility she bore not just for sacred masks, but for protecting the people she loved from consequences of choices she'd made. Agent Morrison, what kind of protective measures are you talking about? Surveillance, regular check-ins, possibly temporary relocation if the threat level escalates beyond what local law enforcement can manage. Hayes's organization operates with sophisticated resources, but they're also careful to avoid direct confrontation with federal authorities when they know they're being monitored. David had been listening to the conversation with growing concern, apparently recognizing implications that hadn't occurred to Margaret. Agent Morrison, what about the tribal community that received the masks? Could Hayes target them for retaliation? Mr. Crowfeather, tribal law enforcement has been coordinating with our investigation from the beginning. The Leech Lake Reservation has sovereign jurisdiction that provides additional layers of protection, and tribal police have been briefed on Hayes's methods and resources. Agent Morrison turned back to Margaret with expression that balanced professional authority with personal sympathy. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to understand that what you did today, participating in the repatriation ceremony and refusing Hayes's pressure to sell sacred objects, represents exactly the kind of citizen cooperation that makes federal investigations successful. You've helped us document criminal behavior while ensuring that cultural artifacts reach their rightful communities. Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning in her fireplace. The recognition from federal law enforcement that her choices had been legally sound and morally correct provided validation that complemented the spiritual blessing she'd received from Elena Crowfeather. She'd begun the day as a frightened widow protecting objects she'd inherited by accident. She was ending it as someone whose courage had contributed to justice on both spiritual and legal levels. Agent Morrison, Sarah said, speaking for the first time since law enforcement had arrived, what can my mother expect going forward? Will she need to testify in court proceedings? Will Hayes continue to represent a threat to our family's safety? Ms. Thompson, federal investigations of this scope typically take months to reach court proceedings, and witness testimony is usually provided through depositions rather than public trial appearances. As for ongoing threats, Hayes's organization is sophisticated enough to recognize when continued pressure would bring more federal attention than any potential profit would justify. Agent Morrison collected contact information and arranged for regular check-ins that would monitor the situation without disrupting Margaret's daily routine more than necessary. Sheriff Bradley promised increased patrols of the area and provided Margaret with direct communication numbers that would ensure rapid response if Hayes made any further attempts at intimidation. As law enforcement departed and evening settled over the farmhouse, Margaret found herself alone with Sarah and David, three people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by a day that had begun with desperate flight and had concluded with official recognition of their courage and integrity. "Mom," Sarah said as they sat around the kitchen table where the morning's planning had taken place, "I owe you an apology for doubting your judgment about this situation. When I received those phone calls from Hayes's people, I was so focused on protecting you from what seemed like poor decision-making that I didn't consider the possibility that you were actually protecting something more important than financial security." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Sarah, you don't need to apologize for being concerned about my welfare. But I hope you can understand that the blessing Elena Crowfeather spoke about, the ancestral protection that comes from honoring sacred responsibilities, These represent security that's more reliable than any bank account or investment portfolio. David nodded in agreement. Miss Thompson, what your mother accomplished today will provide your family with connections to the tribal community that extend far beyond this specific situation. Elder Crow Feather doesn't offer ancestral blessings lightly, and when she speaks of protection for bloodlines, she's referring to spiritual forces that will guide and guard your descendants for generations. Sarah studied both of them with expression that suggested she was trying to reconcile practical concerns with concepts that transcended her usual analytical frameworks. I'm still not sure I completely understand the spiritual aspects of what happened today, but I can see that it's given both of you a sense of purpose and strength that goes beyond anything material security could provide. Margaret felt gratitude for her daughter's openness, for the willingness to consider possibilities that challenged her assumptions about what constituted real protection and genuine prosperity. Sarah, the ancestors don't require complete understanding. They only require respect for choices that honor sacred responsibilities and trust that some protections operate beyond human comprehension. As darkness settled completely over the farmhouse and David prepared to return to the reservation, Margaret walked with him to his truck for a private conversation that would conclude their shared adventure. "David," she said, "I need you to carry a message back to your grandmother. Tell Elena Crow Feather that I understand the responsibility that comes with ancestral blessing, and that I'm prepared to honor whatever guidance the spirits provide for my family's future." David smiled with warmth that transformed his bruised features. "Mrs. Thompson, my grandmother already knows that you understand. She told me this morning that the ancestors had been evaluating you for months, testing your heart through dreams and visions, preparing you for the choice you made today." Margaret thought about the months of grief and isolation that had preceded David's arrival, the sense of purposelessness that had dominated her life since Robert's death. Now she understood that even her mourning had been part of a larger pattern, a spiritual preparation that had made her ready to accept responsibilities she'd never imagined. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the masks safely returned and Hayes neutralized by federal investigation, what role do I play in the ongoing relationship between our families and your tribal community? Mrs. Thompson, you're now part of our extended family in ways that transcend legal or cultural boundaries. When tribal elders speak of bloodline blessings, they're creating spiritual kinship that will connect your descendants to our people for generations. Your great-grandchildren will grow up knowing stories about the widow who protected sacred masks and returned them to their people." David climbed into his truck and rolled down the window for final words. "My grandmother asked me to tell you that the sacred grove on your property will always be a place of power and protection for your family. The ancestors who blessed your bloodline will maintain their presence there, available to guide and guard your descendants whenever they need spiritual strength." As David's truck disappeared down the gravel driveway, Margaret walked to the sacred grove one final time before returning to the farmhouse. The ancient trees stood silent in the darkness, but she could feel the presence that had guided her through the day's challenges, spiritual forces that had transformed her from isolated guardian to honored family member in a community that understood the true meaning of sacred responsibility. The stone circle at the heart of the grove seemed to glow with subtle light that had no earthly source, and Margaret understood that she was witnessing the visible manifestation of ancestral blessing, the tangible evidence that her choices had been recognized and rewarded by forces older than recorded history. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah had prepared a simple meal that they shared in comfortable silence, mother and daughter reconnecting after months of misunderstanding and divergent priorities. The day's events had given them common ground that transcended their different approaches to problem solving, shared recognition that some challenges required courage that operated beyond practical considerations. "Mom," Sarah said as they cleared the dinner dishes, "I've been thinking about what Agent Morrison said regarding ongoing federal protection and the possibility that Hayes might face serious criminal charges. If his organization is dismantled, does that mean other families who've been protecting cultural artifacts will be safe to come forward with repatriation efforts? Margaret considered the question, recognizing that her individual choice to honor sacred responsibilities might have broader implications for cultural preservation efforts throughout the region. I think what happened today represents more than just the return of 7 masks to their people. It demonstrates that ordinary families can successfully challenge criminal organizations when they have support from both spiritual and legal authorities. As they settled into the living room where Robert's photograph smiled down from the mantelpiece, Margaret felt her husband's presence joining the ancestral forces that had blessed her bloodline. Robert would have been proud of her courage, she realized, proud that she'd chosen honor over financial security, proud that she'd trusted spiritual guidance over practical calculations. "Sarah," Margaret said, "I want you to understand something important about the future. The blessing that Elena Crowfeather spoke about, the ancestral protection that will guard our family for generations, this isn't just spiritual insurance against misfortune. It's a calling to continue serving as bridge between communities, to use whatever influence we've gained to support cultural preservation efforts that help other families make choices similar to the one I made today." Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to understand that her mother's transformation represented ongoing responsibility rather than completed mission. "What kind of bridge building are you thinking about?" The Whispering Pines Museum could become a center for educating the public about repatriation laws and the spiritual significance of cultural artifacts. We could host workshops that help families identify objects that should be returned to tribal communities, provide resources that make the repatriation process less intimidating for people who want to do the right thing but don't know how to navigate federal procedures. Margaret paused, organizing thoughts that were still forming in her mind. We could also work with tribal communities to create educational programs that help non-Indigenous people understand why cultural preservation matters, why objects like the masks represent living traditions rather than historical curiosities. Sarah's expression suggested growing interest in possibilities that would allow her marketing skills to support meaningful cultural work. "Mom, that's actually a brilliant strategy for leveraging the recognition you've received into broader social impact." Agent Morrison mentioned that Hayes's organization has been targeting families throughout the upper Midwest. If we could create resources that help those families resist pressure and complete proper repatriations, we could multiply the effect of what you accomplished today. Margaret felt excitement building as she realized that her individual act of courage could become the foundation for systematic change that would benefit tribal communities throughout the region. The ancestral blessing wasn't just recognition of past guardianship. It was empowerment for future service that would honor the sacred responsibilities she'd inherited and chosen to embrace. That night, as Margaret prepared for her first peaceful sleep in months, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred since David Crowfeather's arrival at her farmhouse. She'd begun the day as a lonely widow struggling with grief and financial pressure. She was ending it as an honored member of an extended spiritual family, protected by ancestral forces and empowered to serve as bridge between communities that had been divided by historical trauma and cultural misunderstanding. The masks were home where they belonged, their spiritual power restored through proper ceremony. Hayes's criminal organization was under federal investigation that would prevent further trafficking in sacred objects. Margaret's own family had been blessed by ancestors who would guide and protect her descendants for generations. And most importantly, the foundation had been established for ongoing work that would help other families make choices that honored cultural heritage rather than exploiting it for profit. As Margaret drifted toward sleep, she heard voices in the wind that moved through the sacred grove, ancestral spirits singing songs of gratitude and blessing that would echo through time as long as her bloodline honored the sacred responsibilities they'd inherited. She'd become part of a story larger than her individual life, a guardian whose courage had been tested and found worthy of recognition that would endure for generations. The widow who had protected Ojibwe burial masks from thieves had been blessed by ancestors who understood the true meaning of courage, and her bloodline would carry that blessing forward through time as a reminder that some trusts are too sacred to break, some responsibilities too important to abandon for the promise of easier paths. Margaret Thompson slept peacefully in her farmhouse that night, surrounded by spiritual protection that would guard her family forever, dreaming of future generations who would know the story of their ancestors' courage and the blessing she'd earned by choosing honor over profit, sacred responsibility over personal security. The ancestors were watching, and they were well pleased with their newest guardian's understanding of what it meant to protect what cannot be replaced or forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.